Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift into the humid after-midnight streets of New Orleans, where neon glows through thick air and power hides behind quiet smiles. This is the world of Carlos Marcello, a man who didn't chase attention, but commanded it from the shadows, where patience was a weapon and loyalty was currency. Most couldn't survive a life like this, not because of danger alone, but because it demanded control, silence, and the ability to move unseen. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city noise fade, and settle in as we ease into the quiet, calculated world of Carlos Marcello. The story begins not in the humid, jazz-soaked streets of New Orleans, but across an ocean, under a different, older sun. In the ancient Tunisian capital of Tunis, in the winding maze of the Medina, a boy named Calogero Minacour came into the world in 1910. The air smelled of salt from the nearby port, of spice merchant stalls, and of centuries of history layered like the dust on the narrow alleyways. His parents, Giuseppe and Luigia, were Sicilian, part of a community caught between worlds, holding on to the old ways while navigating a North African reality. This was where the foundation was laid, in a place of crossroads of cultural blending, where survival often meant understanding the unspoken rules of power and trade. When Calogero was just a child, his family made the monumental decision to seek a new life. They boarded a ship, joining the great wave of southern Italian and Sicilian immigration, their sights set on the promised land, America. But their destination wasn't the crowded tenements of New York's Little Italy. The Minacour family was drawn to a place that echoed the climate and the chaotic, soulful energy of their Mediterranean home, New Orleans, Louisiana. They arrived in a city that was itself a world of contradictions. Elegant streetcars clattered past majestic oak trees draped with Spanish moss, while in the bustling French Quarter, the air thrummed with the sounds of ragtime piano, Cajun French, and a dozen different accents. For immigrant families like the Minacours, the promise was tempered by harsh reality. They settled in a poor, working-class neighborhood where Giuseppe, like so many fathers, took on backbreaking labor to provide. It was here that Calogero Minacour began his transformation into the man history would remember as Carlos Marcello. Even as a young boy, the streets were his real classroom. The official schoolhouse held little interest for him. He was small in stature, but what he lacked in size he made up for in a fierce, observant intelligence and a preternatural understanding of leverage. He watched everything. He saw how the local grocer might pay a small weekly sum to a certain man to ensure his windows weren't broken. He noticed how the police walked different patrols in different neighborhoods, their presence sometimes a comfort, sometimes a threat. He understood instinctively that in the struggle to rise from the bottom, there was an entire shadow economy operating just beneath the surface of legal society. His first forays into this world were small, almost innocent. Running numbers for an illegal lottery, known as the policy or bolita, was a common side hustle for sharp kids in the neighborhood. It was a game of chance that offered a dream of a windfall to the poor and a steady, reliable income to the men who organized it. Carlos was good at it. He was reliable, had a good memory for faces and debts, and knew how to move through the streets without drawing undue attention. He was earning, but more importantly, he was building a reputation. The pivotal moment in his early life came from a confrontation that could have ended his story before it truly began. As a teenager, he got into a fierce dispute with a local bully over a gambling debt. The fight was violent and left the other boy severely injured. The police arrested Carlos. In that cold, holding cell, facing the prospect of hard time in a Louisiana state prison, a brutalizing system that could break a young man forever, Carlos experienced a chilling clarity. The system was not designed to help someone like him. It was a machine to process and punish. But the shadow world he'd been flirting with had its own systems of justice and protection. Word of the arrest reached the right ears. Influential men in the community, men who saw potential in the tough, smart kid, intervened. Perhaps a word was spoken to a detective, or a favor called in with a judge. The exact mechanics were, and always would be, hidden in the fog of backroom dealings. The result, however, was clear. The charges were mysteriously reduced. Carlos served a shockingly short sentence for such a serious assault. This was his true baptism. The message was seared into his psyche. The official power of the state could be negotiated with or even circumvented by the right kind of unofficial power. Loyalty to the street and its rulers could offer protection that the law never would. He walked out of that experience not as a chastened young man, but as a committed one. He had seen the blueprint. He left behind the name Calogero Minacor. It was too long, too foreign, too clearly tied to the struggling immigrant past. He needed a name that fit his new ambition, one that sounded smoother, more American, yet retained a certain old-world authority. He chose Carlos Marcello. It had a ring to it. It was a statement of intent. Now, in his early 20s, Marcello was done running small-time numbers. He set his sights on the vice that was both ubiquitous and, in the eyes of the authorities, a low-priority marijuana. In the 1930s, the drug was illegal but not yet the focus of major federal crusades. Marcello saw an opportunity. He organized a robust distribution network, smuggling shipments into the port of New Orleans and controlling their sale throughout the city's clubs, bars, and street corners. It was a business built on logistics, trust, and intimidation, all skills he was rapidly mastering. His success did not go unnoticed. He was making money, but more importantly, he was making a name. And in the structured, hierarchical world of organized crime, a rising star inevitably attracts the attention of the reigning powers. For Marcello in New Orleans, that power was embodied by a man named Sam Caralla, the quiet, formidable boss of the city's Sicilian faction. One evening, Marcello received a summons he could not refuse. He was to meet with Caralla. This was not an invitation to socialize. It was a job. Interview conducted in the parlors of power. Marcello, with his sharp suit and even sharper mind, presented himself. He was respectful but not subservient. He understood the protocols. Caralla, a traditionalist who valued subtlety and business acumen over flashy violence, saw something in the young man. He saw ambition, but ambition tempered with a calculating mind. He saw a potential earner, a diplomat, a successor. Marcello was brought into the fold. He was given greater responsibilities, protection, and a mandate to expand. His marijuana operation became part of a larger machine. He learned the art of political corruption, how to cultivate friendships with police officers, lawyers, and city officials with strategic envelopes of cash or well-timed favors. He was no longer just a gangster. He was becoming a racketeer, a fixer, a part of the city's unseen infrastructure. By the late 1930s, Carlos Marcello was a wealthy, influential man in his underworld circles. He married his sweetheart, Jacqueline, and began to cultivate the image of a respectable family man and businessman. He invested in legitimate fronts: restaurants, nightclubs, real estate. He was building a fortress of prosperity, with one foot in the glittering nightlife of New Orleans and the other firmly planted in its shadowy underworld. The boy from Tunis had not just adapted to America. He had learned how to bend a piece of it to his will. But the higher he climbed, the more dangerous the winds became. The federal government was starting to pay attention, and a man named J. Edgar Hoover was building files on men like him. The first act of Carlos Marcello's life was over. The second act, a decades-long battle with the might of the United States government, was about to begin. The late 1930s and early 1940s in New Orleans were a time of shadows and spotlights. While the world marched toward war, the city's underbelly conducted its business in a persistent, humid twilight. For Carlos Marcello, this period was his graduate education in power. He was no longer the hungry young Turk fighting for a corner. He was a recognized earner, a man on the rise within Sam Caralla's organization. But recognition brought with it a new set of dangers, not from rival street gangs, but from the meticulous, bureaucratic gaze of the federal government. His first major lesson in this new arena came from an unexpected source: the United States Army. With America's entry into World War II, the nation mobilized. The draft swept up millions of young men, including those whose occupations were informally listed. Marcello received his notice. For a man deeply entrenched in running a sprawling marijuana distribution network and various other illicit ventures, the prospect of spending years in uniform was not just an inconvenience. It was an existential threat to his empire. But Marcello had learned the art of the fix. Through a web of contacts, a doctor with flexible ethics, a clerk in the draft board office who understood the value of friendship, a diagnosis was procured. Carlos Marcello, it was officially determined, suffered from a severe sinus condition. The paperwork declared him 4F, medically unfit for service. It was a small, quiet victory, a demonstration of how influence could bend even the mighty machinery of the wartime state. While other men shipped off to basic training, Marcello remained in New Orleans, his business flourishing amid the wartime economy. The incident cemented a principle he would rely on for decades. Every system, no matter how large, was operated by individuals, and individuals could be reasoned with. As the war ended, a new America emerged, and with it, new opportunities. The nation was wealthier, more mobile, and thirsty for entertainment. Marcello, with his keen sense for profitable vice, looked beyond marijuana. The real money, he understood, was in gambling. Not the small-time policy racket of his youth, but large-scale, organized operations that catered to both the working man and the high roller. He turned his attention to Jefferson Parish, the sprawling area adjacent to New Orleans proper. At the time, it was a patchwork of rural land, sleepy towns, and crucially, a sheriff's department perceived as more flexible than the New Orleans police. Here, Marcello and his associates began to plant the seeds of a gambling empire. They opened a series of bookie joints and illegal casinos, often housed in unassuming buildings along the highways. These weren't the glamorous casinos of Vegas. They were functional, efficient money-making machines. A bettor could place a wager on anything from a horse race in New York to a numbers draw, all under the protection of Marcello's organization. Protection was the key. Running an illegal casino required more than just dealers and slot machines. It required ICE, the systematic bribing of law enforcement and public officials to ensure raids never happened, or if they did, were nothing more than a gentle slap on the wrist. Marcello excelled at this. He cultivated relationships not with loud threats, but with quiet, consistent transactions. He understood that a sheriff or deputy on a modest salary might appreciate a regular, generous supplement to ensure his blindness was particularly acute on certain nights of the week. He built a wall of paid silence around his operations. His personal life mirrored this climb toward respectability. He and Jacqueline moved their growing family to a luxurious estate on David Drive in Metairie, in Jefferson Parish. The property, which he named Churchill Farms, was no mere house. It was a statement. With its manicured lawns, stables, and imposing gate, it projected the image of a Southern gentleman, a successful businessman. He hosted barbecues, contributed to local charities, and played the role of the community patriarch. The duality was complete. The respected suburbanite by day, the racket's kingpin by night. This carefully constructed world faced its first major quake in 1947. The national spotlight, which had largely ignored the vice of New Orleans, suddenly swung toward it. Senator Estes Kefauver, an ambitious Tennessee Democrat, was appointed to lead a special committee investigating organized crime in interstate commerce. The Kefauver Committee, as it became known, traveled the country, holding dramatic televised hearings that brought the shadowy figures of the underworld into American living rooms for the first time. When the circus came to New Orleans, Carlos Marcello was a prime target. He was subpoenaed to testify. The hearing room was packed, flashbulbs popping. Senators and prosecutors hurled questions, trying to get him to admit to his alias, his arrest record, his source of income. Marcello sat calmly in his sharp suit. He invoked the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination not once, but over 150 times. He was polite, unflappable, and utterly uncooperative. To every question about his business, his associates, or his wealth, he gave the same rehearsed response. I respectfully decline to answer on the grounds that it may tend to incriminate me. The performance was a masterpiece of defiance. It made him a national figure, albeit an infamous one. The headlines blared, "The Little Man's Silence." He was portrayed as a sinister puppet master. But back in New Orleans, the performance had a different effect. In the underworld, his stoic refusal to cooperate, to rat, was a badge of honor. It demonstrated his reliability, his understanding of omerta, the code of silence. To the corrupt officials on his payroll, it was a relief. He had shown he could withstand immense pressure without breaking, without naming names. The Kefauver Committee ultimately produced a report labeling him a top rackets boss. It was a public relations blow, but it did little tangible damage. No new laws could touch him directly. The local machinery of protection he had built held firm. The federal government had shown its hand, and he had weathered the storm. He emerged from the experience with a hardened understanding. Publicity was a weapon to be managed, and congressional committees were a temporary nuisance, not a permanent threat. He returned to Churchill Farms, to his businesses more powerful than before. The notoriety had, in a perverse way, cemented his status. He was now the man in the Gulf Coast rackets. But the confrontation had changed the game. The federal government now had him squarely in its sights. A young, relentless lawyer named Robert F. Kennedy was reading those Kefauver Committee reports with intense interest, filing the name Carlos Marcello away for future reference. The peaceful, profitable shadows of the 1940s were receding. The 1950s would dawn with a colder, more persistent kind of light aimed directly at his throne. The 1950s dawned on a New Orleans that was changing, and Carlos Marcello changed with it. The national notoriety from the Kefauver hearings had an unexpected effect. It streamlined his authority. With the spotlight burning, smaller, independent operators found the heat too intense. They either fell away or sought the shelter of a larger, more powerful organization. Marcello's consortium grew stronger, more centralized. He was no longer just a prominent racketeer. He was becoming the de facto administrator of the Gulf Coast's underworld economy. His business portfolio expanded with the times. The simple bookie joints and marijuana distribution of the past were now components of a vast, diversified criminal enterprise. He moved heavily into the vending machine business, a perfect, cash-heavy industry that could be dominated through strong-arm tactics to secure lucrative locations in bars, factories, and diners. He invested in nightclubs not just as fronts, but as profitable ventures that also served as hubs for networking and deal-making. One of his most famous acquisitions was the Beverly Country Club, a swanky establishment on the outskirts of the city. Here, beneath the veneer of respectable golf and dining, the real business of the region was often conducted in hushed tones. But the federal government was not idle. The publicity from Kefauver had painted a target on his back, and the agencies of the U.S. government began to take aim with more precise tools. Their first major assault was not on his rackets, but on his very right to be in the country. The Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, reopened his case. They argued that Marcello's original entry into the United States as a child had been technically illegal, and that his subsequent naturalization as a citizen was therefore fraudulent, based on his concealed arrest record. It was a bureaucratic attack, aiming to undermine the foundation of his entire life. In 1953, the government succeeded. A federal judge stripped Carlos Marcello of his American citizenship. He was no longer Calogero Minacor, the naturalized citizen. He was now an alien, a stateless man living on borrowed time. The next step was inevitable, a deportation order. The government wanted him gone, removed from the soil he had so thoroughly manipulated to his advantage. This was the gravest threat Marcello had ever faced. Exile would mean the total collapse of his empire. He fought back with every legal maneuver his expensive attorneys could devise, dragging the process out for years. But in 1961, the final order came down. Federal agents took him into custody, put him on a plane, and flew him south. His destination was not his birthplace of Tunis, which would have no him, nor Sicily, but a place chosen for its obscurity and lack of extradition treaties, Guatemala. The government's plan was to strand him there, They presented Guatemalan officials with a hastily arranged passport and a packet of paperwork alleging he was born in the Central American nation. It was a clumsy, transparent ruse. The Guatemalans, unimpressed and unwilling to accept a notorious American gangster, refused him entry. For 48 hours, Marcello was in a nightmarish limbo, shuttled between Guatemala, El Salvador, and Costa Rica, a prisoner in the sky, rejected at every stop. Finally, in a move of sheer desperation, the U.S. government plane landed back in Miami. Marcello, exhausted and furious, was released. He had been literally thrown out of the country, only to have the door slammed in his face. He returned to New Orleans a folk hero in certain circles. The government's heavy-handed attempt to exile him had backfired spectacularly, making him seem both persecuted and resilient. He famously told reporters, "I'm like a cork in the ocean. I keep popping back up." The deportation ordeal, while a public humiliation for the Justice Department, was a transformative crucible for Marcello. It removed any last vestige of illusion. This was no longer a game of cat and mouse with local police. This was a war for survival with the full might of the United States. It bred in him a deep, personal, and abiding hatred for the Kennedy administration, particularly Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, whom he saw as the architect of his torment. Back on his home turf, Marcello adapted. He became even more insulated, more careful. He conducted meetings not in back rooms, but in the open air of his sprawling Churchill Farms estate, where electronic listening devices were less likely to be planted. He communicated through layers of associates, a practice called insulation, designed to protect him from direct testimony. He ran his operations like a corporate CEO, delegating authority but maintaining ultimate control. The government shifted tactics. If they couldn't throw him out, they would try to lock him up. The IRS began meticulously examining his finances. The FBI increased surveillance. The goal was to build a tax evasion case, the same tool that had finally toppled Al Capone. They tracked his spending, his properties, his lifestyle, all of which far exceeded any reported legitimate income. In 1959, they thought they had their chance. Marcello was indicted by a federal grand jury for perjury, accused of lying about his criminal record on his original naturalization application years earlier. The trial was a major event. The government presented its evidence, detailing his long history in the rackets. Marcello's defense was simple. He was a successful businessman, a family man, persecuted because of his heritage. The jury deliberated and returned with a verdict: not guilty. It was a staggering defeat for the government. Once again, Carlos Marcello had walked out of a federal courtroom a free man. The cork had popped back up, but the net was continuing to close. The acquittal in 1959 was not an exoneration. It was a stay of execution. Robert Kennedy, now riding the momentum of his brother's ascent to the presidency, was more determined than ever. He created a special Get Marcello squad within the Justice Department, dedicating resources and manpower solely to the goal of putting the New Orleans boss behind bars. As the 1950s ended, Carlos Marcello stood at the peak of his power and in the crosshairs of his most powerful enemies. He controlled an empire built on gambling, vice, and corruption from the Texas border to the Florida panhandle. He lived like a king on his pastoral estate, but the world outside his gates was changing. A new, young, and intensely moralistic administration had taken power in Washington, and they viewed him not just as a criminal, but as a symbol of the old, corrupt order that needed to be eradicated. The tranquil surface of life at Churchill Farms was about to be shattered by a storm bearing the name Kennedy. The dawn of the 1960s brought a cold wind to Churchill Farms, one that carried the distinct chill of a vendetta. With John F. Kennedy in the White House and his brother Robert installed as Attorney General, the full weight of the federal government shifted. From a general pursuit of crime to a focused personal crusade, Robert F. Kennedy's Get Marcello squad was no mere bureaucratic assignment. It was a mission fueled by a deep, almost moralistic fervor. To the Kennedys, Marcello embodied everything their new frontier was meant to clean up: the entrenched, shadowy corruption that bled the common man and mocked the rule of law. Marcello felt the change immediately. The surveillance became oppressive, blatant. Unmarked cars sat at the end of his driveway for days. Agents followed his children to school, his wife to the market. His phone, he was certain, echoed with hollow silence, a sign of being tapped. This was psychological warfare, designed to unnerve, to isolate, to make him feel the walls closing in. He responded not with panic, but with a fortress mentality. His life contracted to a tighter orbit around his estate and a few highly secure locations. Business was conducted in whispers during walks through his own gardens, or in the rumble of moving cars where hidden microphones would struggle with engine noise. The government's legal strategy also evolved. They needed a charge that would stick, something a jury could understand. The answer: conspiracy. Isolating a single crime was difficult with Marcello's insulated structure, but conspiracy, the agreement to commit a crime, could rope in the boss through the actions of his subordinates. They began to target his inner circle, flipping lower-level operatives with promises of leniency, building a pyramid of testimony they hoped would point directly to the man at the top. The first major salvo in this new war was fired in 1961. Marcello was indicted, along with several associates, on charges of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The case centered on the mysterious disappearance of a key witness in a prior investigation, a man who had simply vanished before he could testify. The government alleged Marcello had ordered the witness taken care of. The trial was a media circus, a repeat of the Godfather spotlight but with higher stakes. Once again, Marcello sat, impeccably dressed, a picture of calm defiance. His defense attacked the credibility of the government's witnesses, painting them as desperate criminals saying anything to save their own skins. The strategy worked. After deliberation, the jury returned another verdict: not guilty. The acquittal was a triumph, but a Pyrrhic one. The legal costs were astronomical. The public scrutiny was relentless, and the Kennedys were not deterred. They were incensed. The battle was taking a toll on Marcello's health. He began suffering from anxiety, from stomach troubles. The pressure of being America's most wanted rackets boss was a physical weight. It was in this atmosphere of suffocating pressure that one of the most controversial and shadowy chapters of Marcello's life allegedly unfolded. According to later revelations from government informants and FBI files, in the summer of 1962, a seething Marcello allegedly voiced his desperation in the most extreme terms. He was recorded, through an informant wearing a wire, discussing the Kennedy problem in stark, metaphorical language. He supposedly told an associate that if you wanted to kill a dog, you didn't cut off the tail, you cut off the head. The meaning, as interpreted by law enforcement, was chilling. Removing Robert Kennedy, the tail, would not stop the attack. Only removing President Kennedy, the head, would end the pressure. Whether this was the venting of a frustrated man, a serious plot, or something embellished by informants seeking favor, remains one of history's darkest ambiguities. What is clear is that Marcello had both a powerful motive and a vast criminal network capable of facilitating violence. He also had something else: a deep connection to the world of New Orleans, where a complex, troubled man named Lee Harvey Oswald was living in the months leading up to November 1963, after the cataclysm in Dallas on November 22, 1963, the world changed forever. For Carlos Marcello, the immediate change was one of atmosphere. The intense, personal pressure from the Justice Department evaporated overnight. Robert Kennedy, shattered by grief, resigned as Attorney General within months. The Get Marcello squad lost its driving force and its political backing. Marcello, like all prominent figures with possible motives, fell under the immense, sprawling gaze of the Warren Commission investigation. He was interviewed. He denied everything, offered alibis, and expressed, publicly, his sorrow over the president's death. No evidence was ever directly linked to him. The commission's report made no definitive finding of conspiracy, leaving a void filled by endless doubt and speculation. In the aftermath, Marcello did something telling. He did not celebrate. He did not expand his operations boldly. He retreated further. The Kennedy assassination, regardless of his involvement, represented a line no one in the underworld was ever supposed to cross. The resulting heat was bad for business, forever. He had won his war with the Justice Department by circumstance, not by victory, and the cost was a perpetual cloud of infamy far darker than any racketeering charge. The mid-1960s found him a quieter, more cautious king. The empire still functioned, the gambling, the vending machines, the corruption, but the ambition to expand was gone. The goal now was preservation, stability, and weathering the next inevitable storm. He had learned that the government could be fought, outlasted, and even humiliated. But he had also learned that some events cast shadows so long, they could eclipse a lifetime of calculated maneuvering. The cork was still afloat, but the ocean around it had become a sea of whispers, suspicions, and a history too heavy for any one man to ever fully escape. The late 1960s settled over New Orleans like a thick, slow-moving bayou fog, and in its midst Carlos Marcello moved with the deliberate caution of a man who knows he is being watched by ghosts and government agents in equal measure. The intense, white-hot spotlight of the Kennedy years had dimmed, but it was replaced by a colder, more persistent light, the fluorescent glare of institutional scrutiny. The war was no longer personal, it was bureaucratic, and in some ways that was more dangerous. With Robert Kennedy gone from the Justice Department, the crusade lost its fiery heart, but the machinery he built kept turning. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover continued its surveillance. The IRS maintained its audit. The goal was no longer a dramatic, headline-grabbing deportation or a single shocking trial. The new strategy was one of attrition. 1,000 small cuts, a relentless pressure on every facet of his business and personal life. Marcello adapted again. The flamboyant, public figure of the early 60s receded further. He became a phantom in his own city. Business was conducted through an ever-widening buffer of lieutenants and lawyers. He spent more time at Churchill Farms, tending to his lemon trees and stables, playing the role of the retired gentleman with such conviction that he might almost have believed it himself. The cash-heavy vending machine and pinball operations began to be phased out or sold, too visible, too easy to track. He shifted investments into less conspicuous areas. Real estate holdings through shell companies, portions of oil and gas ventures, and the ever-dependable world of union influence, particularly in the trash hauling and construction industries. But the world outside his gates was changing in ways even he couldn't fully control. The National Syndicate, the loose confederation of crime families known as the Commission, was facing its own existential threats. New, more aggressive families were rising, and the old rules of territory and respect were breaking down. The heroin trade, which Marcello had largely avoided as too hot and too morally fraught, even by his standards, was exploding, bringing with it a new generation of violent, unpredictable traffickers who had no allegiance to the old Sicilian codes. The first real crack in his armor appeared not from a dramatic trial, but from a familiar, mundane source: taxes. In 1966, the IRS succeeded in convicting him on federal tax evasion charges. The case was built not on his rackets, but on the simple, provable fact that he lived a millionaire's lifestyle while reporting the income of a middle-class shopkeeper. It was the Capone strategy refined. The sentence was relatively light, 2 years, but the symbolism was profound. For the first time, the cork was forced underwater. He served his time at the federal prison in Springfield, Missouri, a model inmate who kept his head down and his mouth shut, all the while maintaining iron control over his empire through trusted messengers. Prison did not break him, it hardened him. He emerged in 1968 more determined to fortify his legacy. He focused on his family, bringing his younger brother Joseph into a more prominent role, and on embedding his operations so deeply into the legal economy that they would become indistinguishable from legitimate business. However, the legal landscape was shifting under his feet. The most formidable weapon ever wielded against organized crime was crafted during this time: the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO. Passed in 1970, RICO was a legal earthquake. It allowed prosecutors to target an entire criminal enterprise, tying together previously isolated crimes like murder, gambling, and extortion into a single, sweeping conspiracy charge. It meant the boss who never pulled a trigger but gave the orders could finally be held accountable for the whole pattern of crime. Marcello, the corporate-style racketeer, was the perfect prototype for a RICO target. The government began its long, painstaking work using wiretaps, now more sophisticated, financial forensics, and the pressured testimony of increasingly terrified underlings to build a massive case. The hammer fell in the late 1970s. In 1979, a federal grand jury indicted Carlos Marcello under the RICO statute. The indictment was a sweeping narrative of his criminal career, alleging decades of corruption, bribery, and violence. This was not a single charge. It was the story of his life, told by the prosecution as an epic of crime. The trial, which began in 1981, was the culmination of a half-century struggle. The government presented a mountain of evidence: decades of FBI surveillance logs, financial records, and the star witness, a former Marcello lieutenant named Joseph Hauser, who had worn a wire for the FBI. The defense, as always, attacked the credibility of the witnesses, painting them as liars and traitors. They portrayed Marcello as an old man, a simple fruit and vegetable salesman, a reference to one of his fronts, persecuted for his success. But the times had changed. The mystique of the silent, dignified mob boss had been replaced in the public eye by the brutal reality of films like The Godfather. The jury saw not a folk hero, but a criminal CEO. After lengthy deliberations, they returned a verdict: guilty on all counts. For Carlos Marcello, now in his 70s, it was the end of the road. In 1982, he was sentenced to serve 17 years in federal prison. An appeals court later reduced the sentence, but the outcome was final. He entered the federal penitentiary at Texarkana, a frail old man surrounded by hardened criminals, a king dethroned. His empire, so carefully built on layers of insulation and loyalty, began to crumble almost immediately. Without his guiding hand and intimidating presence, factions warred, old arrangements broke down, and new, hungrier organizations moved in on his territory. The fortress had held against external assaults for decades, but its foundation was one man. With that man removed, the walls turned to sand. In 1989, after serving nearly 7 years, a broken and ailing Carlos Marcello was released on compassionate grounds. He was suffering from dementia and numerous physical ailments. He returned to New Orleans, not to Churchill Farms, but to a modest house, his mind and body failing. The man who had once commanded the Gulf Coast's underworld, who had outfoxed senators and battled attorneys general, could no longer remember the battles he had fought. He lived out his final years in a fog of obscurity, a stark contrast to the decades of notoriety. He died in 1993 at the age of 83. There were no grandiose funerals, no dramatic headlines about the end of an era. The world had moved on. The story of Carlos Marcello, the boy from Tunis, the king of New Orleans, the nemesis of the Kennedys, the target of RICO, was finally over. It was a story that spanned the better part of the American century. A dark, intricate tale of ambition, power, corruption, and the relentless, grinding pursuit of justice, proving that even the most resilient cork, after a lifetime of bobbing, eventually sinks beneath the waves. The city of New Orleans in 1989 was a carnival of noise and color, a place that had always moved to its own rhythm. But for the frail, confused man being helped from a car onto the sidewalk of a modest suburban home in Metairie, the music had faded to a distant, incomprehensible hum. Carlos Marcello was home, but he was a stranger in his own life. His release from federal prison had not been a triumph. It was a medical discharge. The man who once commanded rooms with a glance now struggled to recognize his own reflection. Dementia, that cruel thief, had been steadily erasing him piece by piece during his final years behind bars. The formidable mind that had built an empire, outmaneuvered senators, and memorized complex webs of loyalty and profit was now a tangled haze. He returned not as a king reclaiming his throne, but as a ghost haunting the edges of his former kingdom. The world he came back to was unrecognizable. The New Orleans underworld had transformed. The structured, almost corporate syndicate he had presided over was fragmented. The old codes of omerta and respect had corroded, replaced by the volatile, street-level economics of the crack cocaine trade. Young, ruthless crews operated with a terrifying, short-sighted violence that Marcello had always considered bad for business. His own organization, once a seamless blend of shadow and light, had splintered. Some of his former lieutenants were imprisoned themselves, victims of the very RICO laws that had ensnared him. Others had been marginalized by new powers. The fortress of Churchill Farms was no longer his. It had been sold to pay his astronomical legal fees. The empire was not just in decline. It had been annexed, plundered, and rewritten by a new generation that spoke a different, more brutal language. For his family, his return was a heartbreaking burden of care, layered atop a legacy of notoriety. They shielded him as best they could, but the past was a ghost that wouldn't stop knocking. Occasionally, a reporter would call, seeking a comment on some new mob-related headline, only to be told the old man was ill and could not speak. Historians and true crime authors sent letters, seeking an interview for what they called the definitive account. The letters went unanswered, or were returned by a family member with a terse, "No thank you." There were flashes, moments when the fog would part. Sitting in his small, quiet living room, he might stare at the lemon tree in the backyard, a sad echo of the vast groves at Churchill Farms, and a word would surface. "Gumbo," he might mutter, apropos of nothing, or "the Beverly." These were fragments of a shipwrecked life, bobbing to the surface. The spicy, communal stew of his city, the nightclub where deals were made. Then the fog would descend again, leaving behind only confusion and a faint, lingering agitation. The legal battles were over. The government had won. The once indomitable little man had been reduced in the official record to a case number, a convict who had served his time. In the annals of the FBI and the Justice Department, he was a closed file, a trophy on the wall of the organized crime section. The decades-long war of attrition had ended not with a bang, but with the silent, administrative click of a folder being placed in a storage drawer. His physical health declined in tandem with his mind. The tough, compact frame that had carried him from the streets of Tunis to the pinnacle of power was now stooped and brittle. The savvy eyes that missed nothing were now clouded and vacant. He required constant care, a reversal of roles for a man who had spent a lifetime being the ultimate provider, the fixer of all problems. On March 3, 1993, the long fade reached its end. Carlos Marcello died at his home. He was 83 years old. The cause was listed as a heart attack, but those close to him knew he had been disappearing for years. The obituaries that followed were lengthy, but they carried a tone of historical conclusion, of a chapter firmly closed. They recounted the highlights: the rise from immigrant poverty, the Kefauver hearings, the war with the Kennedys, the RICO conviction. They noted the persistent, unproven rumors linking his name to the ultimate American mystery. But they all ended on the same note: the final, diminished years, the obscurity, the illness. His funeral was a small, private affair, a stark contrast to the large, showy spectacles of other fallen mob bosses. There was no mile-long procession of limousines, no legion of silent, dark-suited men paying their respects. It was a family goodbye, quiet and solemn. He was buried in a Metairie cemetery, under a marker that bore his chosen name, Carlos Marcello, a name that was itself a creation, a tool, and finally, an epitaph. In the days that followed, the city of New Orleans, ever resilient and forward-looking, barely paused. The streetcars kept running on St. Charles Avenue. The jazz played on in the clubs of the quarter. The political machinery grinded on, undoubtedly still greased in places by the old, hidden arrangements he had perfected. Carlos Marcello's story did not end with a dramatic last stand or a shocking revelation. It ended with a whisper, with a slow dimming. His legacy was not a dynasty. His children did not inherit his throne, for the throne itself had been dismantled. His legacy was more subtle and perhaps more profound. He was a blueprint and a cautionary tale. He was the blueprint for how to build a regional criminal empire woven into the fabric of a major American city, a model of corruption as infrastructure. And he was the cautionary tale of its inevitable cost, not just in prison time, but in the final, total price of a life spent in the shadows, where the respect and power of the daylight world can never truly be claimed. The cork had finally sunk. The ocean of history, which he had navigated with such cunning for so long, closed over him quietly, leaving behind only ripples of rumor, court transcripts, and the undeniable truth that in America, no empire built in darkness can forever keep the dawn at bay. The silence that settled over the small Metairie cemetery after Carlos Marcello's burial was not the silence of an ending, but the quiet beginning of a reckoning. With the king gone, the kingdom he had built, a kingdom of whispers, coded nods, and meticulously kept ledgers, faced its final, irreversible audit. The machinery of justice, which had pursued him for over 4 decades, did not shut down with his death. Instead, it shifted focus, turning its relentless energy toward dismantling the system he had left behind. The tool for this dismantling was the very law that had finally put Marcello behind bars: RICO. In the years following his imprisonment and death, federal prosecutors in New Orleans and beyond launched a series of surgical strikes aimed at the heart of what was left of his organization. They targeted not the myth, but the mundane mechanics. The cases had dry, technical names: United States versus the estate of Carlos Marcello, regarding back taxes and asset forfeiture, cases against remaining lieutenants for continued gambling operations, labor racketeering, and fraud. One by one, the pillars were removed. The vending machine routes that had been a cash lifeline were seized or sold off to legitimate companies. The hidden interests in the garbage hauling unions were exposed and broken by federal monitors. The corrupt arrangements with certain local sheriffs and police officials, which had survived on loyalty and fear, withered under the glare of FBI scrutiny and the threat of prison. The network of friends in City Hall and the courthouse found that their phone calls were no longer returned. The unspoken understandings evaporated in the cold light of a new era of scrutiny. The human element of the empire scattered. Some of Marcello's oldest associates, men who had operated in his shadow for 30 years, faced their own RICO indictments. Offered the choice between dying in prison or cooperating, a few of the weaker links chose to talk. Their testimonies were not the dramatic, headline-grabbing revelations of a shooting war, but rather tedious, detailed accounts of money flows, profit shares, and the specific wording of instructions passed along a chain of command. This was the final, inglorious chapter, the bureaucracy of crime meeting the larger, more powerful bureaucracy of the state. For Marcello's immediate family, the aftermath was a complex mix of grief, relief, and the heavy burden of a notorious name. They had lived their entire lives in the long shadow of his double life. They had enjoyed the comforts his wealth provided, the fine homes, the private schools, while also enduring the FBI agents at the school gates, the whispered judgments in social circles, the endless subpoenas, and the glaring headlines. After his death, they sought what they had never truly had: anonymity. They sold off remaining properties, dispersed assets, and largely retreated from public view. The name Marcello, which had once opened doors and inspired fear in the muddy world of Louisiana politics and business, now became something to be carried quietly, a name that prompted a knowing look and a change of subject. In the broader underworld, his passing marked the definitive end of an era. The model he perfected, the deep, patient corruption of a single region, the emphasis on political protection over flashy violence, the corporate structure, was already becoming obsolete. The 1980s and 90s belonged to transnational drug cartels with military-grade firepower and global money laundering networks. The new players were not patient Sicilian gentlemen conducting business at a rural farm. They were ruthless conglomerates operating across borders. The territory Marcello once controlled along the Gulf Coast became a patchwork of smaller, more violent street gangs and independent operators, none possessing the overarching authority or strategic patience of the old boss. Historians and journalists began the work of assessment. They pored over the thousands of pages of FBI files released through Freedom of Information Act requests, the transcripts of the Kefauver and McClellan Committee hearings, and the voluminous records of his trials. The picture that emerged was not of a cartoonish gangster, but of a uniquely American figure, an immigrant who used the tools of capitalism and corruption to build parallel power in a system that initially excluded him. He was analyzed as a case study in the resilience of local syndicates and as a prime example of why the RICO statute was necessary. And then, of course, there was the eternal, unanswerable question that ensured his name would never fade completely into dry history books. his alleged connection to the assassination of President Kennedy. Every few years, a new book, documentary, or declassified document would stir the murky waters. A memo from a long-dead FBI agent would surface, mentioning an informant's tip about Marcello's anger. Researchers would comb through Lee Harvey Oswald's nebulous time in New Orleans, searching for a possible ghostly link to Marcello's web. Conspiracy theories would weave elaborate tales, placing him in shadowy rooms with other supposed plotters. But for every tantalizing what if, there was a solid wall of absence. No direct evidence, no credible witness, no smoking gun. The official record remained unchanged. As a result, Carlos Marcello occupies a perpetual, eerie space in the American imagination, not just as a mob boss, but as a permanent resident of history's maybe. He is a figure standing just outside the frame of the nation's most traumatic snapshot, a ghost in the periphery of Dealey Plaza. Back in New Orleans, the city itself moved on as it always does. The restaurants he once owned changed names and concepts. The Beverly Country Club was sold and redeveloped. The political machine, while still famously colorful and occasionally corrupt, no longer had a single dominant puppet master pulling its strings from a pastoral estate. The story of Carlos Marcello became local lore, a dark fairy tale told about the bad old days, a reminder of a time when the city's vice was not just a tourist attraction in the French Quarter, but a structured, invisible industry. The final victory did not belong to Marcello, nor did it wholly belong to the government that hounded him. The final victory belonged to time and to change. The world that allowed a Carlos Marcello to exist, a world of limited federal power, of strictly local law enforcement, of impenetrable ethnic silos and unrecorded cash transactions. That world was gone. He was its most successful and enduring product, and its last great king. When he died, the kingdom died with him, not with a revolution, but with a sigh, its territories mapped not in street corners and parishes, but in the millions of pages of a federal case file that finally, definitively, closed. In the years that followed the quiet burial and the legal dismantling, the story of Carlos Marcello underwent a strange metamorphosis. It began to separate into two distinct threads, woven from the same dark yarn but creating different patterns. One thread was made of cold fact, curated in government archives and academic papers. The other thrived in the warm, fertile soil of myth and memory, in the back rooms of old New Orleans and the endless corridors of the internet. The factual thread was meticulously cataloged. The U.S. National Archives and the FBI's vaults held the physical evidence of his life and their pursuit. Stacks of surveillance logs noting his comings and goings from Churchill Farms, decades of tax returns with their glaring omissions, thousands of hours of wiretap transcripts, most of them frustratingly mundane, filled with discussions of produce prices and family gossip, with the incriminating gems buried deep and spoken in code. For historians of organized crime, this became a primary source, a Rosetta Stone for understanding the business model of mid-century American syndicates. Scholars pored over the financial trails, marveling at the simplicity and effectiveness of his operations. They noted how he avoided the flashy violence of Chicago or New York, preferring the steady, silent pressure of corruption. In university seminars, he was presented not as a monster, but as a case study in entrepreneurial crime and systemic failure. Meanwhile, the mythic thread grew wilder and more persistent. In the dimly lit Italian restaurants of Metairie and the weathered social clubs of the French Quarter, old-timers who claimed to have known a guy who knew a guy would share stories over espresso. The tales grew in the telling. He wasn't just rich, he had a vault buried under Churchill Farms. He didn't just bribe officials, he owned governors. He wasn't just angry at the Kennedys. He was the architect of the century's greatest crime. These stories were rarely told with fear or condemnation, but with a wry, almost prideful nostalgia. He became a folk anti-hero, a symbol of a time when the city's vice was controlled by one of its own, a man with manners who kept a certain order, a preferable devil in some minds to the chaotic, anonymous violence that followed. This folk memory was crystallized by popular culture. While he was never the direct, named subject of a major film like The Godfather as Vito Corleone, savvy viewers could see his shadow in certain characters. The soft-spoken Southern gentleman who ruled with quiet calculation, whose power was invisible until you ran afoul of it. True crime authors found him a compelling subject, a figure whose life had a novelistic arc. The immigrant rise, the epic battles with the Kennedys, the Shakespearean downfall. These books often focused on the tantalizing what-ifs, ensuring his name remained tethered to Dallas. For the city of New Orleans itself, his legacy was more atmospheric than tangible. Tour guides on certain crime tours would point out the sights of his old clubs or gesture vaguely toward Metairie when speaking of his farm. It became a part of the city's rich tapestry of scandal, filed alongside tales of pirates, voodoo queens, and corrupt governors. His story confirmed a certain self-image New Orleans held, that it was a city apart, a place with its own rules, where things operated in the beautiful, complicated space between the legal and the accepted. The most profound and personal legacy, however, was borne by his family. They carried the double weight of loss and notoriety. For his children and grandchildren, Marcello was not a name of power, but a name that required explanation, that prompted curiosity laced with judgment. They navigated a world where some people sought to get close to them out of a morbid fascination with the past, while others might quietly distance themselves. Their inheritance was not an empire, but a complicated history. They became custodians of private memory in a world obsessed with the public myth. Theirs was the Carlos Marcello who loved his garden, who had a taste for certain foods, who was a grandfather, a man utterly divorced from the kingpin and the conspirator of legend. And then there were the conspiracy theories, which took on a life of their own, evolving in the digital age. Online forums became crowded with virtual detectives connecting dots across decades. A scanned FBI memo from 1962 would be posted, its ambiguous language parsed for hidden meaning. A grainy photo of Oswald handing out leaflets on a New Orleans street would be examined, with users wondering who might be watching from a car in the background. The lack of evidence became, perversely, proof of its own, evidence of a cover-up so perfect it erased its own tracks. In this space, Marcello was no longer just a mobster. He was a key in a vast, unsolvable lock, a permanent resident of American history's darkest what-if. By the dawn of the 21st century, the man had been completely subsumed by his story. The facts were settled. A poor immigrant who built a vast criminal enterprise through cunning and corruption, who fought the law until the law, with new tools, finally won. But the myth was unsettled, and perhaps forever unsettlable. It lived in the space between the lines of the official record, in the haunted question of motive and opportunity that lingered after November 22, 1963. The final irony of Carlos Marcello's journey was this. He spent a lifetime striving for control over his territory, his income, his public image, his legal fate. He built walls of silence and layers of insulation. Yet, in the end, he lost all control over his own narrative. He became a public figure, a historical token, a cultural archetype, and a ghost in a national nightmare. The boy from Tunis who reinvented himself as Carlos Marcello ultimately had his story reinvented by history, by folklore, and by a nation's endless need to make sense of its deepest wounds. The cork had sunk, but the ripples he left behind kept spreading, morphing into shapes he could never have imagined, in a world that had long since moved on from the rules of his shadowy, bygone kingdom. The turn of the millennium brought with it a final, formal closing of the book on the Carlos Marcello era. Not in the whispered lore of New Orleans, but in the stark, bright light of the American judicial system. The process was bureaucratic, unemotional, and thorough. It was the epilogue written by the victors. The primary instrument was the ongoing work of the Internal Revenue Service and federal asset forfeiture units. 4 years after Marcello's death, a specialized team within the IRS continued to trace the labyrinthine financial pathways of his empire. Their work was a forensic archaeology of hidden wealth. They followed the trails from long-shuttered betting parlors and forgotten shell companies, through layers of nominees and front men, to tangible assets. Parcels of land in Jefferson Parish, interests in long-forgotten real estate developments, residual shares in businesses that had once been cash cows. One by one, these assets were identified, seized, and liquidated. The proceeds did not go to heirs. They were absorbed by the federal government as restitution for decades of tax evasion and illicit profit. The last major seizure came in the early 2000s, when the government successfully claimed final, disputed properties tied to Marcello's web of holding companies. It was a quiet news item, buried in the business section of the Times-Picayune. Feds finalized Marcello asset forfeiture. The article was a few column inches. The war was over, and this was the paperwork. Concurrently, the historical and legal communities reached a consensus. With the benefit of declassified documents and the perspective of time, biographers and scholars published definitive accounts. These works, unlike the sensational true crime paperbacks of the past, were heavily footnoted and sober in tone. They drew a clear, undeniable picture. Marcello was a pioneering and exceptionally successful regional crime boss whose model of deep, political corruption was uniquely suited to the culture of Louisiana. They confirmed he was a bitter enemy of the Kennedy administration, and they uniformly concluded that while he possessed clear motive and means regarding the assassination of President Kennedy, no credible, direct evidence had ever been found to place him in a conspiracy. The FBI officially listed its investigation into any Marcello connection to the assassination as closed, not for lack of suspicion, but for lack of prosecutable evidence. The file was marked inactive. For the government, the case had reached its terminus. In New Orleans, the physical world Marcello had shaped continued to vanish. The Beverly Country Club, once the jewel of his public-facing empire, was sold and redeveloped into a bland office park. The specific buildings that housed his most famous bookmaking operations were demolished or repurposed, their history known only to a dwindling few. Churchill Farms, the pastoral seat of his power, changed hands multiple times. The new owners had no connection to the past. They were simply wealthy families seeking a large estate. They remodeled, landscaped, and erased. The lemon groves were cut back. The specific rooms where backroom deals were made became playrooms or home offices. The human network decayed with time. The old soldiers of his crew passed away or faded into obscurity. The lawyers who had crafted his defenses retired. The corrupt officials he had cultivated were voted out, died, or were themselves replaced by a new generation whose graft, if it existed, was of a different, more digital kind. The world of cash envelopes and face-to-face understandings was succumbing to a world of digital transfers and federal monitoring. Yet, in the city's soul, a residue remained. It wasn't a residue of fear, but of a story. Marcello entered the pantheon of New Orleans characters, a figure as intrinsic to the local mythology as Marie Laveau or the pirate Jean Lafitte. He was part of the city's understanding of itself, a place that always danced along the line between the proper and the possible, where charm could mask calculation, and where power didn't always wear an official badge. Annual historical tours began to include a crime and corruption route, where well-informed guides would speak of the Pendergast machine in Kansas City and the Daly machine in Chicago, and then, with a knowing smile, speak of the Marcello machine in New Orleans. They presented it as a phenomenon, a system, stripping away the man's personal mythology and discussing his operation as one would a unique but defunct political entity. For his family, this period brought a painful but necessary clarity. With the legal matters settled and the assets gone, the relentless pressure finally ceased. The phone stopped ringing with requests from authors and documentarians. The last of the civil suits were resolved. They were left, finally, with just their name and their private memories. The notoriety became a static part of their past, rather than an active intrusion into their present. They could, at last, remember the man as a father and grandfather separate from the public icon. And so, the story of Carlos Marcello reached its true conclusion not with a bang, but with the quiet turning of a page in a history textbook. He was analyzed, categorized, and understood. The myth was compartmentalized as folklore. The facts were entered into the record. The American experiment had produced him, endured him, and ultimately, using its own evolving laws and persistent institutions, had dismantled what he built. The final lesson of his long life was one of scale. He had mastered the ecosystem of a city and a state, but he could not outlast the gathering, patient might of a determined federal government armed with new legal tools. He was a giant in a small, shadowed pond. When the sunlight finally pierced the canopy and the pond was drained, the giant was revealed to be a figure of mortal scale, his power an illusion of context. Carlos Marcello's legacy, in the end, is not a secret treasure or an unsolved murder, but a demonstrated truth. That in the long arc of the American story, no shadow empire, no matter how well constructed or deeply rooted, can ultimately withstand the slow, grinding force of a nation's stated intent to impose its rule of law. In the hushed, high-ceilinged reading room of the National Archives, a researcher turns a page. The paper is crisp, the typewritten lines faded but clear. It's a routine FBI teletype from 1962, noting the license plate of a car seen near Churchill Farms. In a library at Tulane University, a graduate student highlights a passage in a PhD dissertation analyzing the economic impact of mid-century vice operations in the Gulf South. On a laptop in a suburban living room, someone scrolls through a true crime forum, pausing at a blurred image of a man in a fedora, the caption asking, "Was this Marcello's driver?" Carlos Marcello's story never truly ends because it has ceased to be a single story. It has fractured into 1,000 fragments, each piece reflecting a different light, studied by different eyes for different reasons. He has become data, subject to the quiet, perpetual analysis of history. The boy from Tunis who became the Phantom of New Orleans left behind a legacy that is neither glorious nor simply villainous, but profoundly instructional. His life is a masterclass in the mechanics of a certain kind of power that operates in the gaps of the system, that thrives on human weakness, personal loyalty, and the careful management of fear. For students of criminal justice, his career is a textbook on the evolution of organized crime and the legal tools forged to combat it. The RICO statute, which finally ensnared him, stands as a monument to the kind of threat he represented. For the city of New Orleans, he is a permanent, if subtle, character in its biography. You cannot fully understand the political and social landscape of 20th century Louisiana without acknowledging the shadow he cast. He was part of the ecosystem, a force of nature in a city accustomed to navigating between the official and the real. His name is invoked not with the terror of a Al Capone, but with the weary familiarity of a perennial fact of life, like humidity or hurricanes. The Kennedy question ensures his name echoes in a darker, more national chamber of memory, ties him forever to America's deepest wound. He will always be one of the ghosts in the gallery of suspects, a man positioned at the sinister intersection of motive and means. This connection guarantees his story will be revisited with every new generation, each applying its own tools and biases to the unresolved mystery. He is forever frozen in that moment of possibility, a figure standing in the doorway between a known past and an unfathomable event. But beyond the history books and conspiracy theories, there is a simpler human end to the tale. It is found in the quiet respect of a family's private remembrance, in the fading memories of a complicated man who loved gardens and grandchildren. It is in the final piece of a name that no longer opens doors or strikes fear, but simply is a fact of a family tree, a subject for genealogists. The American experiment is one of constant tension between ambition and order, between the individual's drive and the society's rules. Carlos Marcello lived this tension in its most extreme form. He used the tools of capitalism and corruption to build his own version of the American dream from the shadows, creating wealth and influence on a staggering scale. But the very system he manipulated eventually produced the antibodies to reject him. A determined press, relentless federal agencies, and finally, laws powerful enough to pierce his layers of insulation. His story, in its final analysis, is a testament to time. Time eroded his power, time freed his family from his notoriety, and time transformed the living, breathing man into a set of facts, a series of lessons, and a collection of unanswered questions. The empire of fear and favor is gone. The loyalties have turned to dust. All that remains is the record, the millions of words in court transcripts and FBI files, and the echo. As the researcher closes the folder, as the student shuts the dissertation, as the forum user clicks to another tab, the story recedes again into the vast archive of the American past. Carlos Marcello's journey, from a sun-drenched Medina to a Louisiana prison to a quiet grave, is complete. He was a king whose crown was made of secrets, and whose kingdom, in the end, proved no match for the slow, patient, an immutable force of a nation's enduring effort to write its own story in the light.